Charleston, South Carolina, 1822. Before dawn, when the air was still thick with the smell of salt and wet earth, the Whitmore plantation already stirred. The wind sighed through the cane fields, brushing over the graves no one spoke of. Somewhere beyond the magnolia trees, the big house loomed, white columns gleaming like bones in the moonlight. But inside, there was no sound. Not even the floorboards dared to creak. Silence wasn't absence here, it was a rule. A form of control. Every whisper had weight. Every step, every breath, monitored by eyes that never seemed to blink. The enslaved learned early that quiet wasn't peace, it was survival. The kind of silence that pressed against your ribs until even your thoughts whispered back. In that silence lived Charity. An older woman now, her hands calloused from decades of washing the master's linen, her back curved from carrying both barrels and babies. They called her the breeder, a word that stripped her of everything but her womb. On paper, she was property, one of dozens of productive women whose fertility lined the Whitmore fortune. But in truth, Charity was something else. She remembered. Each cry of a newborn taken from her arms was carved somewhere deep in her mind, etched into bone. 23 times she had given life. 23 times it had been stolen. The plantation's owner, Elijah Whitmore, didn't use whips often. He preferred something quieter. A ledger. In neat, precise handwriting, he recorded every birth, every body, every ounce of value. To him, creation was arithmetic. But to Charity, it was memory. And memory, even buried, finds ways to rise. At night, when the house settled into its stillness, Charity would listen, not for footsteps, but for what came after them. The moan of wood, the rustle of leaves, the hum of spirits that refused to be silenced. The quarters whispered of old gods, of women who birthed vengeance. Sometimes, Charity thought she could hear her children in the wind, faint, fragile voices calling her name through the moss. She would close her eyes, press a hand to her chest, and whisper back, "Mama remembers." There was a power in that, the smallest rebellion imaginable. To remember what the world demanded she forget. Outside, the fields slept under the pale eye of the moon. Inside, the master's study glowed faintly. Whitmore sat alone, surrounded by his ledgers and lies, sipping brandy, rewriting the lives of others as numbers. But even he felt it sometimes, that hush before a storm, the kind of silence that isn't peace but warning. Because silence can starve a soul. And on that plantation, something had started to stir, something born from centuries of swallowed screams, waiting for a voice. They said Charity was lucky, a strong breeder, worth more than most. That was what the men in the ledgers wrote beside her name. Strong hips, still fertile, no history of sickness. To them, she was a number wrapped in skin. To the women in the quarters, she was both feared and pitied. Because on plantations like Whitmore's, motherhood wasn't a gift, it was a sentence. Babies were born not into arms, but into auctions. New life didn't mean joy, it meant profit. And for women like Charity, every cry of a newborn was just another goodbye dressed as a beginning. She had started bearing children when she was barely a girl herself. 13. Too young to understand what was being taken from her. The first time she thought she was sick. The swelling, the pain no one explained. When the child came, she bit her wrist to keep from screaming.
A boy.
She named him Malachi. He was taken before sunrise. After that, she learned. She learned to stay quiet, to breathe through pain, to let them take what they wanted, her body, her milk, her children, and still somehow keep a piece of herself buried where no hand could reach. They called her the breeder, as if it were praise. But to Charity, it was a curse, a brand invisible but burning. Each pregnancy left her weaker. Her bones ached. Her womb felt like an old wound that refused to heal. Yet the overseer kept marking her down. Still capable, they said. Still useful. She worked the fields between labors. She washed the mistress's gowns the day after giving birth. She bled quietly into the earth that drank everything and gave nothing back. And yet, Inside her, a strange kind of strength began to grow. Not the strength of muscle, but of memory. She could remember every birth, the scent, the hour, the sound of that first cry before it was taken. When others forgot, she did not. Some nights, when the sky was dark and the swamp hummed low, she would trace invisible names on her skin. Malachi, Sarah, Judah. Names no one else remembered. Names she was forbidden to say aloud. Each name was a spark. Each spark was a seed. And slowly, those seeds took root in the cracks of her sorrow. Charity knew her body was their tool, but her memory, that was hers. She carried those memories like weapons hidden beneath rags, sharp and waiting. What they didn't understand was this. A woman who's lost everything isn't empty. She's full of ghosts. And ghosts don't stay quiet forever. The night it happened, the air was too still. Even the swamp seemed to hold its breath. Charity lay on a straw pallet, her body trembling with a pain she thought she'd never feel again. She was 62, far beyond the age they said a woman could bear. But life, or something older than life, had other plans. Outside, the moon hung low, its reflection broken in the muddy water. It looked like 3 moons, one whole, 2 shattered. Later, the women would whisper that the sky had already known what was coming. Inside the cabin, only one candle burned. Its flame flickered like it was afraid. The midwife, old Deli, sat near Charity's feet, whispering prayers between breaths. "Push," she said softly. "Push, sister. Don't you hold back now." Charity gritted her teeth. Her body had been broken and mended too many times. The ache wasn't just from age, it was from years of carrying grief inside her ribs. But that night, pain felt different. It was electric, ancient, holy even. Then came the first cry, sharp, high, cutting through the dark like a blade. Deli gasped. A boy. Skin pale as milk. Moments later, another. Then another. 3 cries, rising together, blending into something that didn't sound human at all. It sounded like a warning. Charity's heart thundered. Her hands shook as she reached for them. 3 boys. 3 little ghosts. Their hair white as ash, their eyes pale blue, almost colorless. Deli made the sign of the cross. "Lord," she whispered, "what did we just bring into this world?" Charity didn't answer. She only stared, because in those faces, she saw something that made her breath catch, something that didn't belong to the master or the overseer or any man alive. It was something older, something that had survived every whip, every sail, every silence. She pressed the boys to her chest, one after the other, tears falling freely. "You live," she whispered. "You live this time." Then footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. Deli froze. The door creaked. Elijah Whitmore stood in the doorway, a lantern in hand, his eyes wide as if the devil himself had been born on his plantation. The overseer behind him crossed himself and muttered, "They're white." Whitmore stepped closer. The light caught his trembling hands. 3, he said hoarsely. 3 of them. Charity met his gaze, her eyes fierce even through exhaustion. "They're yours," she said. The words hung there, heavy, undeniable. Whitmore staggered back. The overseer's face twisted in disgust. "You want me to?" "No," the master snapped. "Hide them. No one speaks of this." The men left with the children. The door slammed, and for the first time in her life, Charity screamed, not from pain, but from something deeper, something raw and ancient that the world wasn't ready to hear. Outside, the night swallowed the sound whole. 3 moons glowed faintly above the fields. 3 children cried in the dark. Morning crept slow across the fields, but light didn't reach the quarters. Not really. It pressed against the windows like it didn't dare come inside. Charity hadn't slept. Her body ached in places that didn't have names anymore, pain that wasn't just flesh, but history repeating itself. The midwife had gone quiet. The other women avoided her eyes, whispering behind their palms. 3 white babies born to a black woman. That was a story that could burn a whole plantation. But Charity didn't care. For the first time in decades, she felt something other than emptiness. Her children were alive. Hidden, yes, but alive. And this time, she would not let the world erase them. That evening, when the sun dipped low, she limped to the old shed behind the wash house, the place they'd hidden the triplets. The air inside was thick with straw and smoke. The babies lay together in a wooden crate lined with rags, their pale eyes open, unblinking. They didn't cry. They just watched her, still and silent, like they'd been waiting for her to return. She knelt beside them, her breath trembling. "Mama's here," she whispered. "Mama always come back." One of them, the smallest, reached out a tiny hand, brushing her finger. The touch felt electric, almost burning. Charity froze, tears catching in her throat. These weren't ordinary children. They couldn't be. She began to hum. Not the hymns the mistress demanded, not the songs of forced worship. This was older, a tune her own mother had hummed on the ship from the Gold Coast. A song that spoke of oceans, of blood, of spirits that followed the living home. The babies quieted. The air seemed to thicken, listening. Later, Charity took a scrap of linen from an old dress and a piece of charcoal from the hearth. By the firelight, she began to write. Names. Dates. Malachi, 1802. Sarah, 1806. Isaiah, 1810. All 23. Every child she had born and lost. She stitched the linen into the lining of her skirt, close to her skin. "If they want to bury my story," she whispered, "they'll have to dig me up to do it." That night, she dreamed of the 3 boys standing by the river. Their skin glowed faintly, like light beneath water. They called her name, not with words, but through the air itself. When she woke, she knew what she'd done wasn't just memory. It was invocation. Those names, every stolen child, had been written into the world again. And with every stitch, she had pulled the dead a little closer to the living. Charity didn't know yet what that meant. But the swamp did. The wind carried whispers. And somewhere in the darkness, something that had been sleeping for a very long time had just opened its eyes. By the 3rd day, the whispers had already spread. "They say she birthed ghosts," one woman murmured at the wash line. 3 of them, another hissed. "White as bone, eyes like ice." Ain't right. Rumor on a plantation was faster than fire. By sunset, everyone knew. And that's when Ruthven came. He was the head overseer, tall, red-faced, and drunk on authority. The kind of man who smiled only when he was about to hurt someone. He'd known Charity for decades. He was there when her 2nd child was born, when her 5th died, when her back bled for the first time. Now he stood outside the old shed, tapping his cane against the wood. "You in there, Charity," he called. "They say you've been hiding something." Charity rose slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Ain't hiding nothing that ain't mine," she said, voice steady. Ruthven pushed the door open. The light from his lantern crawled across the dirt floor, revealing the wooden crate. 3 pale faces stared back at him, quiet and unblinking. For a moment, even Ruthven went still. "What the hell?" he muttered. He leaned closer. "They look like rats. White rats." "Don't touch," Charity said. Ruthven laughed. "You giving me orders now, old woman?" He reached down, but before his hand could meet the child's skin, the smallest one, Cain, gripped his thumb. A baby's hand, but the strength in it was unnatural. Ruthven shouted, trying to pull away. The grip tightened. Charity stood tall behind him. "Told you," she said quietly. He got his daddy's strength, but none of his mercy. Ruthven tore free, stumbling back, his thumb red and swollen. He spat on the ground, fury and fear mixing in his eyes. "You finally lost your mind," he snarled. "You'll pay for this." He stormed off toward the big house, leaving the door hanging open. Charity turned back to her sons. The candle flickered as if shaken by an unseen wind. "Don't you worry," she whispered. "Ain't no man alive gonna touch you again." That night, Ruthven went to the master. They drank in secret, voices low and sharp. Plans were made. By dawn, a new order spread through the quarters. The pale boys were to be moved. Charity knew what that meant. Not safety. Erasure. When night came, she crept back to the shed. The boys slept quietly, their faces lit by the dying fire. She gathered them, one in her arms, two in a basket, and slipped into the swamp. The air was heavy, the mud swallowing her steps. Somewhere, an owl called her name. She found the old hollow tree her great-uncle once hid in while running from dogs. She laid the boys inside, wrapped in moss and cloth. "Mama coming back," she whispered. "Mama always come back." By morning, Ruthven would be gone, swallowed by the same swamp he mocked for years. Some said he fell. Others said something pulled him under. But the quarters whispered something else entirely. The white babies took him. When Ruthven's body was found hanging by one ankle in the old breeding barn, no one spoke. Not the master. Not the field hands. Not even the dogs. The air around the plantation shifted that morning. Thick, heavy, watchful. It was as if the land itself had taken a deep breath and decided not to let it go. Elijah Whitmore called it an accident. Said the overseer had been drunk. But everyone knew better. Drunks don't hang themselves upside down with their tongues cut out. And drunks don't leave messages burned into wood. Carved into the barn wall, just above the spot where Ruthven swung, were 3 words written in ash. They remember. That night, the quarters were silent. Not from fear this time, but something closer to reverence. People started lighting candles behind the wash house. Some left bits of bread or feathers by the old tree line. Not offerings of worship, but of warning. Charity didn't light candles. She didn't need to. She knew who had done it. Or what. Her sons had come back. They appeared at her door just before dawn, barefoot, silent, streaked with mud and river water. The swamp had marked them, but they were alive. Cain's small hands were scratched raw. Ash's pale eyes glimmered faintly, like moonlight caught in water. Sue clutched a crow feather tight in his fist. Charity knelt in front of them, tears blurring her vision. "You came back," she whispered. "You really came back." None of them spoke, but their stillness said enough. They had seen things, learned things that children weren't meant to know. That morning, she washed them in a bowl of river water mixed with salt and ash. "Not to clean," she murmured, "but to remember." She pressed her fingers against their ribs, tracing invisible symbols, threads beneath each heart. Marks of memory. Marks of protection. When word of Ruthven's death reached Dawson, the breeder's hand, he didn't hide his disgust. Dawson was the one who had turned reproduction into profit, pairing men and women like livestock. He had chosen which bodies were fit for seed, which were spent. He had been the silent god of her suffering for 20 years. Now he circled Charity like a buzzard. "You think you can scare me with ghost stories?" he sneered. "I made you what you are." Charity looked up slowly, her eyes dark and calm. "Then you made your own curse, too." 3 nights later, Dawson was found hanging from the rafters of that same barn, one ankle twisted, his face purple, his tongue gone. The words were there again, this time seared into the wood with fire. They remember. After that, no one dared whisper Charity's name in anger. The workers began to call her something else, the Mother of Vengeance. Because for the first time in her life, Charity wasn't carrying grief anymore. She was carrying power. The plantation had gone quiet again, but this time, it wasn't the master's design. It was fear. Even the birds avoided the trees near the old barn. The swamp smelled of iron and smoke. And every night, crows gathered on the rooftops like sentinels, black shapes against a sky that refused to stay calm. Elijah Whitmore hadn't left his house in days. He drank more, prayed less. His wife, pale and trembling, claimed to hear babies crying in the walls. "The devil's in that woman," she hissed. "The devil's in those children." So Whitmore sent for help, not from law, but from the Lord. When Reverend Charles Elms arrived from Charleston, he came dressed in black, a brass cross hanging heavy on his chest. "I've heard the stories," he told the master. "White-skinned children born of a black woman. Curses written in ash? This is blasphemy. They must be cleansed." The master nodded. "Baptize them." Make them right. Sunday came. The sun never rose bright that morning. It just appeared, dull and heavy, like light forced through smoke. They brought the three boys to the small chapel near the edge of the fields. No congregation, no hymns. Just the master, his wife, the reverend, and a maid trembling so hard the babies nearly slipped from her arms. Charity watched from the trees. Her hands clutched the linen sewn beneath her skirt, where her children's names were hidden close to her skin. She prayed, not to the reverend's God, but to hers, the one who had lived in the rivers long before chains ever crossed the sea. The reverend began, "Dearly beloved, we are gathered to."
He stopped.
The water in the basin rippled, though no wind touched it. "Go on," Whitmore urged. Elms dipped the ladle, pressed a drop of water onto Ash's forehead. The baby shrieked, not in pain, in power. Steam rose where the water touched his skin. The reverend gasped, dropping the ladle. "What is this?" he stammered. "Finish it," the master snapped. "Finish the baptism." Elms lifted his trembling hand again, touching the next child, Sue. The basin began to bubble, slow at first, then violently. Blisters bloomed across the reverend's fingers. He screamed, clutching his burning hand. "Unholy," he rasped. "They're marked." Whitmore stepped forward, furious. "You'll finish what you started." But before another word was spoken, the candle flames burst. The chapel door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The air filled with smoke. The maid dropped the children, who landed unharmed, still, silent, watching. Outside, Charity fell to her knees as the fire roared. The chapel burned faster than wood should. And when it was over, only black beams and ash remained. In the center of the ruins, carved into the altar stone, were three small handprints, pale, perfect, and burned deep. That night, the plantation stopped pretending it was just cursed.
It knew now.
It was haunted. That night, the sky hung low over the Whitmore plantation. No stars, no moon, only the faint red glow of what was left of the chapel smoldering in the distance. The smell of smoke clung to everything, to skin, to breath, to memory. Charity sat outside her cabin, the firelight flickering across her face. Her sons slept nearby, their pale faces calm, untouched by the chaos they'd left behind. They didn't cry. They rarely ever did. But Charity couldn't sleep. She unstitched the hem of her dress, fingers trembling as she pulled out the piece of linen she'd sewn there, the secret record of her stolen children. 23 names, scrawled in charcoal and soot. Malachi, Sarah, Judah, Isaiah. Names the world had erased. She laid the linen across her lap. The fabric was worn thin, but the words still breathed. Each letter looked like a wound that refused to close. "Tonight," she whispered, "you gone have voices again." She gathered ashes from the fire, mixed them with river clay and the blood from her thumb, stirring until it became thick and black as ink. Then she dipped her finger into the mixture and touched it to her son's skin, 3 dots under each of their left ribs. "Not pain," she murmured, memory. The boys didn't flinch. Their eyes stayed open, pale and knowing. When she finished, Charity lifted the linen, pressed it to her chest, and began to speak the names aloud, one by one. Her voice was low, unsteady at first, then stronger with each name. The sound rolled through the quarters like wind through dry leaves. The other women stirred from their sleep, listening. No one interrupted. No one dared. For the first time, those children's names, her children's names, existed again in the open air. By the time she reached the last one, her cheeks were wet. But her tears weren't grief anymore. They were fuel. She tore the linen into 3 strips and handed one to each boy. "You carry them now," she said. "They ain't gone. They never was." Outside, the crows gathered, black wings glinting in the firelight. Their calls echoed like a chorus answering her prayer. From that night on, strange things began to happen. Names appeared scratched into the wood of the wash house, burned onto the undersides of tables, whispered by children in the fields. It wasn't superstition anymore. It was remembrance. Even the master's wife, sleepless and shaking, found words scrawled across her mirror one morning. We remember. The plantation could hide the bodies. It could erase the records. But it could not silence the memory. Because memory, once spoken aloud, becomes alive. And on that haunted land, the dead had started to breathe again. The storm began before the first drop of rain. Wind tore through the moss like it was trying to speak. The dogs howled once, then went silent. Even the swamp seemed to lean in. Inside the big house, Elijah Whitmore sat alone in his study, pistol on the desk, a bottle of brandy open beside him. His hands shook, but not from drink. Every shadow looked like movement. Every creak in the floorboards made him flinch. He hadn't slept in days. His wife had fled to her sister's home in Savannah after finding a cross made of 3 pale fingerprints carved into her bedroom door. Elijah hadn't left the house since. He prayed. He cursed. He loaded his gun and waited. But you can't shoot what isn't flesh. And memory isn't afraid of bullets. That night, the door opened without a sound. Charity stood in the doorway, barefoot, her dress damp with rain. Behind her, the 3 boys, silent as the grave, their pale eyes reflecting candlelight. Each carried something, a rope, a wooden bowl, and a glowing iron fresh from the forge. The master rose, trembling. "Stay back," he warned, voice cracking. I gave you food, shelter." Charity stepped closer. "You gave me pain," she said softly, "and I turned it into seed." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of every scream she'd ever swallowed. She pointed to the corner of the room. "That's where I birthed Malachi alone. You remember? You wouldn't open the door."
She pointed to the bed. "There."
"You took Sarah from me before her breath was cold." Her hand touched the wall, trembling but steady. "And here you pushed me down when I said no." Elijah's lips quivered. "You don't understand." "Oh, I understand," she said. "I just stopped forgiving." Ash stepped forward, his small hands steady as he tied the master's wrists to the chair. Sue placed the wooden bowl on the floor, filled with ashes and water. Cain handed the iron to his mother. The air crackled. The candle flames bent toward her like they recognized their own. Elijah wept openly now.
"Please.
Have mercy." Charity knelt before him. "Mercy," she whispered. "Where was mercy when they took my babies one by one?" The iron hissed as it touched his chest. His scream split the silence wide open, a sound no wind could carry away. When she pulled the iron back, 3 words glowed red across his skin. Mother. Remembered. Justice. She leaned close, her breath calm, steady. "Now the world can read what I couldn't speak." She didn't kill him. Some wounds weren't meant to end that way. Some were meant to live, to rot slowly, to remind. As she turned to leave, the house groaned like it knew its time was done. The boys followed, pale ghosts with living hearts, their bare feet silent against the floorboards. Behind them, the master sobbed in the dark, branded, broken, breathing. And for the first time in his life, he finally heard the silence he had created. Morning broke slow and colorless. The fields, once green and alive with the hum of work, now stood still. Even the birds refused to sing. The Whitmore plantation had begun to die. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, patient unraveling. First, the crops withered. Then the livestock went missing one by one, until only the crows remained. The overseers packed up quietly. The house servants left in the night. And Elijah Whitmore, the man who once commanded the land like a god, never stepped outside again. They said he couldn't bear sunlight. That water hissed against his skin. That his chest still smoked where the iron had branded him. Some said he'd gone mad, tearing mirrors from the walls, muttering to the shadows that gathered at his feet. But the shadows weren't listening to him anymore. They were listening to her. Charity was gone by then, walked east with the first frost, barefoot, carrying nothing. Some swore they saw her on the road to the swamp, her 3 sons following behind like pale sentinels, their eyes unblinking. Others said she was never walking at all. She was gliding like mist. Where she went, the land changed. Rivers ran clearer. The soil turned dark and rich. Children born in nearby villages grew up healthy, fearless. The elders whispered that she hadn't died, she had returned. Not as a woman, but as something older than pain. Something that remembers. Years passed. The big house rotted into the ground. Ivy crawled up its bones. Travelers avoided the road that led to its ruins, saying they could hear, crying at dusk, a woman's voice, low and strong, calling out names in the dark. 23 names. The same names Charity had once sewn into her dress. Some said if you listened closely enough, the swamp itself spoke them too, the wind carrying those syllables through the reeds like a hymn. And deep under the moss, carved into the last standing stone of the plantation, a message remained, faint, but still visible beneath time and rain.
She bore them in chains.
She raised them in silence. She freed them in fire. Beneath that, in faint charcoal, one word:
Charity.
Today, historians call her a rumor. Folklorists call her a myth. But in the Lowcountry, there are still mothers who whisper her name before giving birth, asking for her strength. There are still songs sung by candlelight, where her story is told not as tragedy, but as proof that memory never dies if someone keeps speaking it. And on quiet nights, when the moon rises over the marsh and the water glows white, locals say you can see 3 pale shapes moving through the mist, boys grown tall, walking beside a woman whose face is made of moonlight. They don't speak. They don't need to. They are memory. They are justice. They are her.